Shaliach in Manchester in the north, and he's heavily involved in heading the Bet Midrash Kehlati. He completed the Hesder program at Yeshivat HaKotel and studied at Bet Morashah and at Yeshivat Siach. He is currently a PhD candidate in Bible at Bar-Ilan University, focusing on early Jewish interpretation.
Okay, thank you very much. It's very nice to be here, especially as I just mentioned, such a group of people who, even in the current circumstances, are able to come out and learn and commit time in the middle of university even, and the difficult periods. It really is a big zchut and a big ma'ala that there's such a group, and I'm very honored to be able to give over a short thought connected to the parsha. What we're going to be looking at essentially is what I've termed Yosef's final journey, or the final saga of Yosef's life, and it relates to what we see. This is a picture, for those who know or don't know, of Yosef meeting his brothers in Mitzrayim, a Renaissance work. But what we see, we're going to begin with questions, right, in this week's parsha. At the very beginning, V'beshalach Paro et ha'am, Paro sends the nation, etc., etc. And what's the thing that Moshe does? V'ikach Moshe et atzmot Yosef imo. Moshe takes the bones of Yosef with him, according to the shvuah that the Bnei Israel are undertaken when Yosef asked him to take him up with them to Eretz Yisrael when he was on his deathbed. And the Mefarshim asked the question, and there are a number of questions here, but why was it Dafka Moshe that did that? Why did Moshe take it upon himself? Why wasn't it more of the people? Different Mefarshim and Midrashim and Chazal give different answers. Sometimes the people are seen to be engaging with, taking plunder. And Moshe was the one that went and took the bones of Yosef. But still, the question I actually have two questions. The one question is related to the pasuk here, V'ikach Moshe tatzmot Yosef. Moshe takes the bones of Yosef. And when we read about the burial of Yosef in Sefer Yoshua at the end, it says like this, Vet atzmot Yosef, the bones of Yosef, asher he'elu b'nei Yisrael mimitzrayim, kavru b'Shechem. Right? The bones of Yosef were taken, that b'nei Yisrael took out of Mitzrayim, they buried in Shechem. And so there are two questions that come out of this. One is pointed to by the Radak, and the Radak says, "Afal pi shekatuv v'yal Moshe tatzmot Yosef imo," right? Even though it's written earlier from our parasha that Moshe was the one who took the bones up, who is here b'nei Yisrael alotam? He was the one who told b'nei Yisrael, take him and bury him because he didn't live to see it. And then he goes on and says, "Uvidrash," and this is based on the Gemara in Sotah, anyone who begins with a mitzvah and someone else completes it, it's called on the name, or it's named after the person, the last person who actually completes it. But you see here, the question of the Radak is, why does it say Bnei Yisrael? Why doesn't it say Moshe? Moshe was the one who took out the bones of Mitzrayim. So that's my first question. But really, that question leads me on to a deeper question, which is, why was Yosef buried in Mitzrayim to begin with, right? Why is it that we have this, I don't know if you would call it strange, but we have this, he's a powerful person. His father, Yaakov Avinu, dies in Mitzrayim, and he makes sure and asks Paro to take him up out of Mitzrayim and to bury him in Eretz Yisrael. It's a classic thing to do, to expect that Yosef would do the same. Did he not have the power to do that? Was he unable to put in a request to go to Eretz Yisrael? And that's the second question. And actually, what we're going to go through in the next few minutes is how those questions are actually tied to one another, I believe, and a suggestion for an answer which solves both of those questions. The first question being, why does it say Moshe took the bones of Yosef? And later on says Bnei Israel took the bones of Yosef? And why was Yosef buried in Mitzrayim in the first place? Now, to answer, the basic answer, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, why is it that Yosef didn't bury himself in Mitzrayim, or asked to be buried in Eretz Yisrael, when he died, right? We have Rashi. And Rashi says, ולמה לא השביע את בניו שיסעו לארץ כנען מיד? And why didn't he make his son swear that they'll carry him immediately to Eretz Canaan? כמו שהשביעו Yaakov, just like Yaakov made him swear. Amar Yosef, Yosef said to himself, אני שליט הייתי במצרים. I was a big macher in Mitzrayim. והיה סיפק בידי לעשות, and I could have done it, right? I knew who to talk to and how to do it. אבל בני לא הניחו מצרים לעשות. But my children, they're not machers like I am. They haven't been in Mitzrayim, you know, they don't really understand the politics, perhaps, or they're not of the same stature. And I don't really believe that they're going to be able to do it. Now, obviously, especially you guys who are involved in the Maskirut Menekim understand the nuances of politics negotiation, right? And sometimes it's a bit more complicated for one person to ask than another person to ask for whatever from someone, right? But that's what Rashi essentially says. It wasn't possible for Yosef to ask his sons to. They simply weren't as connected. They weren't as in control as Yosef was. However, I want to suggest two other reasons why Yosef was not buried in Eretz Canaan like Yaakov Avinu, which doesn't necessarily contradict obviously the reason of Rashi. It's just another kivun. And the two reasons go as follows. The first reason is that we need to consider Yosef not only as the son of Yaakov Avinu, right? Yaakov, the patriarch, who brought him to be buried in Eretz Yisrael. Anyone who knows the life of Yaakov Avinu, who had to flee Eretz Yisrael, and Hashem returned him to Eretz Yisrael. When he left Eretz Yisrael, go to Mitzrayim, it was very difficult for him, right? His place was in Eretz Yisrael. But if we think about Yaakov, if we think about Yosef, he was also the son of Rachel. And Rachel, as we know, was not buried in Kivrei Ha'avot, right, in Hebron, actually very close to where I live, in Israel, in Karmei Tzur. But Tamot Rachel v'tikaver b'derech Ephrata hi Beit Lachem, right? And Rachel died on the way, giving birth to Binyamin, and she was in Ephrat, which is Beit Lechem, right? And there's a whole discussion about where that is exactly. We know the place in Beit Lechem today is called Kever Rachel, but it's not Pashut. Even Chazal were aware of this kushia, right, from the texts themselves. But Rachel is not buried in Kivrei Ha'avot, right? She isn't. And when we think about why Yosef asked to be buried in Mitzrayim and then later on taken to Eretz Yisrael, I think one of the reasons is tied to this figure of Rachel. Because as we know in Yirmiyahu, a very famous pasuk, Kol Hashem Kol Bar Manishma Nehi Bechi Timurim, Rachel Mevakal Banea, right? Rachel cries for her sons and she refuses to be comforted, right? And we know that Radak says, he says two things. Firstly, very interestingly, what does it mean, Himevakal Banea? She's crying on all of her sons. They weren't all of her sons, only Yosef and Binyamin were her sons, right? So why is it that she's crying on Banea? And it says, Amar derech mashal al aset shvatim shel Roshai Ephraim, right? The 10 tribes, the head of them is Ephraim, Ephraim being the son of Yosef, and therefore is considered the son of Rachel as well. And it's saying like a mashal, right? Then in general, we're talking about the 10 tribes, and we call them on the name of Rachel. But you see that Rachel cares about her children dearly, all of her children. She remembered all of them. It's as though she's crying on her children because she relates to all of them. And now he quotes something which is also brought in Rashi, a beautiful midrash which talks about how she went to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and said, just like I did chesed for, and allowed Leah and the other people to bring children, so too let my children please come back. Please remember, in my schut. But the other thing, which the Radak mentions, is something which many of us, I think, are aware of. Od yesh drash ki derech kever Rachel holicham begola. There's another drush on this idea. Why is it that she's buried there? Why is it that she's crying al baneha, right? The way of Kever Rachel goes into the galut, right? When you leave Eretz Yisrael, perhaps you go past Kever Rachel. Al ken amar Rachel al baneha. Therefore, it says Rachel cries upon her sons, upon her children. V'darshu zal pasuk. ותיקבר בדרך אפרת, ואמרו, מה ראה יעקב אבינו לקבור את רחל בדרך אפרת? Why did Yaakov Avinu see fit to bury her in Efrat on the way? אלא שציפה יעקב אבינו ברוח הקודש, יעקב אבינו saw ברוח הקודש, שהגלויות עתידות לעבור דרך שם. Because he saw that the future people going into Galut are going to go via her kever. לפיכך קברה שם. Therefore, she was buried there. כדי שתהיה מבקשת עליהם רחמים. She would request rachamim for them, right, etc. And so, that's part of the reason why Yosef wants to be buried in Mitzrayim. He looks to his mother, and his mother was buried where she was buried to accompany Bnei Israel into the Golah, to request rachamim for them. And I believe Yosef wanted the same. Yosef wanted himself to serve as a signpost for Bnei Israel in Mitzrayim, but also, not only as a signpost, he wanted to accompany them in Galut, right? Just like Rachel accompanies Bnei Israel into Galut, and because of that reason, he thought it was important perhaps, to be with them in Eretz Mitzrayim and not to be buried for a number of years in Eretz Yisrael. However, what I want to suggest now is a second reason why Yosef asked to be buried in Mitzrayim. And it's tied to the Gemara also in Sotah. And the Gemara asks, why was Yosef buried in Shechem? Right? Why Dafka Shechem of all the places? Now, the Pshat, or one of the Pshats, is that that's where his Nachala is. Right, that's the place where he's meant to be buried. In fact, one of the Mefarshim say that's because it was actually the most mechubad place, because it was the first place that Yaakov Avinu received in Eretz Yisrael as a nachala. He conquered Shechem, right, and therefore he was buried there. But here the Gemara says something else. Kavrov Shechem, Ma'ishna Shechem, Amar Rav Chama bar Rabbi Chanina, Mishchem ganvuhu u'leshchem nachzir avedato. Right? He was taken from Shechem, that's where he was stolen from. But Shechem, he's going to return when he was lost. If you remember, when Yaakov sent Yosef to check on his brothers, they had gone to Shechem to look after the flock, and Yosef was taken from Shechem. That's where his entire journey began. If you remember, he was looking for his brothers, right? He goes and he finds someone in a field. He's lost in the field, right? And he encounters a malach or an anonymous person, right? And obviously the text there is talking about him being lost in the field, but him looking for his brothers. And he says like this, a famous pasuk, so fused with emotion for anyone who reads it. He says, I'm searching for my brothers. Tell me where they've gone to shepherd the flocks. Now the pshat is he's looking for his brothers, but at a much deeper level, we know that Yosef's relationship to his brothers is what accompanies him throughout his life. Throughout his life, he was looking for his brothers. And in fact, on another level, all of Sefer Bereshit is about the search for brotherhood. Cain and Hevel, right? Yaakov and Esav, Yitzchak and Ishmael. All of it is surrounding the question of brotherhood. All of it is about how you create brotherhood. And, right? And so when Yosef looks for his brothers, it strikes at the very, very heart of Sefer Bereshit, and that is what he is looking for, right? And so when the Gemara says that's where he was taken from, that's where he was stolen from, and that's where he wanted to return, I believe it's also talking about this issue. It's talking about that is where he lost his brothers, and Dafka, that's where he wants to return to. Something very deep in that. And if you look at the end of Sefer Bereshit, Yaakov has just been buried, and they come back to Mitzrayim. This is just before Yosef asks to be buried in Mitzrayim and to return him to Eretz Yisrael. The psukim say as follows: V'yoshav Yosef Mitzrayim hu ve'echav v'chol olim ito likvor et aviv achrei kivro et aviv. Right? Yosef returns to Mitzrayim, him and his brothers and everyone who goes up with him. V'yiru achei Yosef ki met avihem. And they see, the brothers of Yosef see that their fathers died. Now he's going to get back at us. Everything we did to him, he's going to pay us back. Right? By the way, it reminds us of Esav. We'll wait until my father dies, and then I'll go and deal with Yaakov. Right? So Esav had the same thought, and that's what the brothers think. So even at this point, at the end of Sefer Bereshit, after everything that's happened, and the brothers send Yosef to Mitzrayim, and after everything, and the dreams coming true, and Yosef finds his brothers and tells them that Hashem sent me here, and he saves his brothers and everything else, they're still worried that Yosef now is going to deal with them, right, in an unbrotherly way. Yosef le'emor, avicha tiva lifnei moto le'emor, and they told Yosef, right, this is what your father said before he died. Whether it's true or not, who knows? Kol tamru li Yosef, anasana pesha achicha v'chatatam, right? Please forgive them for their sins. Ki ra gamalucha v'ata sana l'pesha avdei elokei avicha v'yevech Yosef v'dibram elav. Right? Again, one of those moments for anyone who's following this theme of brotherhood throughout Sefer Bereshit. It's a moment that hits home. Because what's happening here? They say to him, please forgive the sins, and the God of your forefathers, right? And Yosef cries because what's happened here? What's happened here? He still doesn't have the trust of his brothers. He still doesn't have the trust of his brothers. At this point, there's nothing that can be done, right? The entire book of Bereshit is partially related to brotherhood. And even here, after everything that's happened, it still refuses to come home, so to speak. Am I beneath God to punish you? You wanted to do bad to me. God thought it was good, or thought for the good, so that I will bring the entire nation to live. I'll make sure to take care of you. He spoke to their heart. Don't worry about it. Right, and then he commands them at the end there to bury him in Eretz Yisrael. And so what I want to suggest is that essentially the question that Yosef left with, which is, I am seeking my brothers, was essentially left unanswered in Sefer Bereshit. He actually never found really his brothers. I think Yosef understood at that point in Mitzrayim that regardless of whatever had happened, it would be impossible for him to find true brotherhood, perhaps. And he looked after them and everything else, but it was impossible. And in those circumstances, it was impossible for Yosef to really be buried in Eretz Yisrael. Because as the Gemara says, the idea is from there he was taken, and that's where he needs to be returned. But who tried to take him? His brothers tried to take him, and his brothers need to return him. But in those circumstances, it was impossible for the brothers to come together enough in real brotherhood and love for Yosef to return him to Shechem. The journey that Yosef left with to look for his brothers in Shechem was unable to come to fruition in his lifetime, and could only come to fruition after Yetziat Mitzrayim, after Bnei Israel became a nation, after the Achim really merged into one nation. And Professor Jonathan Grossman, one of my teachers, he always, I don't know if you know him, but he always talks about this, that that the book of Bereshit and Shmot together is the book from brotherhood to nation. And that is what's happening. And that is why, or part of the reason why Yosef wants to delay his return to Eretz Yisrael. He wants to go to Eretz Yisrael when his own journey has been completed, and he can only do that when all of Bnei Israel are together. And that is why you have the discrepancy between Sefer Bereshit, Sefer Shmot, in our Parsha, and Sefer Yoshua. In our Parsha, Moshe takes up the bones of Yosef, but in Sefer Yoshua, after the Midbar and after everything else, it says that Bnei Israel buried Yosef, because the entire point of the burial of Yosef is to return him to where he had been taken from. But not only that, to return the brotherhood that had been taken as well. And it brings to a close the entire journey undertaken by Yosef, and actually the entire journey undertaken throughout Sefer Bereshit. On that note, I just want to end, and perhaps you can also comment or disagree with me. I only know where Sam lives, and I can just go out and fight him, but I'm saying the others I don't, so you can. But just to say, I think oftentimes in life, we have these moments, right? Or we're aiming for something. We're going for a particular goal, and sometimes we're unable to get there, right? Oftentimes, especially when you're younger, you think, oh, I'll do it. I'll get there. And hopefully, Mirz Hashem, most of your goals you'll achieve. I can safely say that I had goals when I was your age, and Baruch Hashem, I've achieved many of them, right? But there are goals, there are things that you'll be unable to achieve. And I think the story of Yosef highlights that sometimes there are things that are just impossible. And what really needs to happen, you need to have faith, you need to have emunah, you have to have belief in kind of the truth of your journey, to know that at the end of time, right, or at some time in the future, they will be achieved, right? I particularly, this is relevant, I know many of you in Bnei Akiva, right, especially when you're working in education and working with young people, you have you want to get to D, right? But you can only move people from A to B maybe, right? On a good day. And I think that's part of it, right? The understanding that as time goes on, eventually you'll get to D. It might not be you, right? But eventually things do come around and things do come to a close. So I'm happy to take questions or whatever, but it was very nice talking to you. And thank you very much for having me. Okay. Have a Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you.
Rav
So
Joel.
much.
Rav Joel, Baruch Hashem.